The other month, we sadly lost Christopher H. Bidmead, the script editor for Season 18, and one of the most interesting minds to ever have worked on Doctor Who. It's a sad reminder, as time goes on, that list of living people who worked on even the later eras of the classic series is getting ever smaller, but also I think a chance to celebrate his vision for the show, which is one of the most unique and interesting there's ever been, and this was certainly not a given from the creative people behind the show in the 1980s. His idea of Doctor Who as smarter and even more sophisticated science fiction, getting the TV series, well, as close to hard sci-fi as it's ever been, i.e. still very, very far away, but a hell of a lot closer than the borderline pantomime it had been under Douglas Adams. It's interesting to look at how different visions for Doctor Who can vary so massively and yet still feel right, and there's not a criticism of either approach, let me make clear. Bidmead's approach did avoid hilariously failed disasters like the Horns of Nymon, to be sure, but we never got anything as good as City of Death either. Different isn't necessarily better or worse. Season 18 is a very odd season overall. It's of course best known as Tom Baker's final season, and one where, despite some wonderful performances from the great man, not least his final one in Logopolis, it was clear he had probably stayed on a year or so too long, and occasionally it became obvious the ground was shifting under his feet. There was new producer, new music, both for the main theme and the incidental music, new costumes, new approaches to visual effects and production design. Basically everything changed except the principal cast, and towards the end of the season it really was just the man himself. It would have been as if Peter Capaldi had stayed on for the first season of Chris Chibnall's era. It would have been bizarre to say the least, and yet that's basically what happened here. Season 18 is also where, in hindsight, Doctor Who suffered the first chip to its status that eventually led to the cancellation at the end of the decade. For the entire 70s, Doctor Who had the status of invincibility. Despite numerous behind-the-scenes problems and drama, it had maintained high ratings and was a staple of the Saturday night TV lineup. It hadn't been since Pertwee's second season that average ratings had been below even 8 million. And yet for this season, they crashed. Even discounting that season 17 was a bit of an outlier because of the ITV strike that propelled City of Death to its now obviously never-to-be-beaten crown of the most watched story ever, ratings plummeted catastrophically. They almost halved going into the season, a paltry 6 million average, and the raw figures are better than the truth. The audience share for the season was even worse than the final 4 seasons of the classic era. For the first time since the 60s, there had been a major ratings slump, and it shattered that sphere of invincibility the show had built up. The reason was competition. In contrast to season 17, where ITV's competition was neutered by the strike, this year they were broadcasting American import Buck Rogers in the 25th century, which was probably the first time the contrast was made with a shiny new series and Doctor Who's lower production values. Now, obviously, Doctor Who lost the battle and won the war. Its cultural relevance remained even through the 90s when it was off the air, while nobody who even occasionally leaves their house remembers Buck Rogers. But this was the first time in a very long time Doctor Who suddenly seemed replaceable. And well, with a long-running tired star and slumping ratings, who could have blamed anyone for thinking that? The slump wasn't terminal, the show moved into its midweek slot for the next season, and that helped revive the ratings for the half-decade that followed, but the crack showed for the first time. But what are the contents of the stories themselves? Well, it wasn't the most consistent season in terms of its story contents. I think it's fair to say the first 2 stories of the season were not enormously radical departures from what had come before, especially when you look at what's on the page. But what followed certainly took a new direction, to the point where the final story of the season rested very heavily on science, basically as hard sci-fi as Doctor Who's ever going to get, as I said. Made up nonsense science, sure, but still science. But that's not the focus today. Today we're looking at what made up the middle part of the season, the E-Space Trilogy, and of course we start with that trilogy's opening story, Full Circle. The trilogy is a very interesting experiment, and one that actually is ahead of its time in a lot of ways. That of an overarching story, one with decisions and consequences, and one indeed that would reach beyond even these 3 stories. And yet it doesn't in any way prevent the 3 stories from telling their own individual tale. As we'll see, this story had a very different origin from being part of some overall arc. It's also, I think, over its 3 stories, a good advertisement for Christopher H. Bidmead's vision of the show, based on science, with interesting plots replacing silly pantomime, and a focus on these things, unfortunately probably to the detriment of character and, well, a bit of humanity in these stories. Full Circle was overall a decent enough story, but one that can be appreciated more as an interesting experimental approach rather than a truly successful story. Let's start on the story proper though, starting as we always do with the production. This was the first story directed by Peter Grimwade, I think one of 80s Who's best directors. He did 3 stories after this, and then turned his hand to writing, which he was rather less good at. He gave us Time Flight, which should tell you what we need to know about his career change, but as a director he was fantastic, bringing us 3 of the best realised stories of the whole classic era, Logopolis, Kinder and Earthshock, all wonderfully dynamic and atmospheric pieces. The story isn't quite as strong as those 3, probably because he was still getting used to the show and also because the script here is a bit more pedestrian than them, but I think he does a good job. The editing's sharp, the atmosphere frequently the right level of moody and contemplative, the cliffhanger to part 1 with the marshmen rising out of the swamp is simply fantastic, and there's a good sign of good directing when a story feels brisk and well paced even when the plot itself slows down. I think my only criticism would be is that the staging and a lot of the scenes in the Starliner feel very off. Sometimes it just seems odd how it's shot and the action never quite works. I think a lot of this is down to the design of the set though, so I'll give Grimwade a pass, especially I know how good he could be after this. So overall good job. Speaking of the set design, I don't think it's one of the stronger aspects of this story. The Starliner is the only real set of the piece, and I just don't think it works. It doesn't have the scope, it looks far too small to really be the focal point of a civilization as it should be. I think this leads to a lot of the odd staging because of how much of the story just ends up feeling like it's set in these generic, narrow corridors. Overall, it looks impractical, it doesn't look particularly lived in. It feels like it's a design television set and exactly that. In fact, the only parts of it that aren't the corridors are this kind of like weird open space that looks like it would be useful for basically absolutely no purpose. Oh, and it's also like really generic and boring, there's no life to it at all. So, yeah, not a fan, unfortunately. Other parts of production, there's the soundtrack, which typically for the era is very effective, atmospheric, has some nice melodies to rely on, gives the story a sound unique to itself rather than anything source of sounding samey as could be the case at other points in the show's history. I wouldn't call it among my favourites, but that's mostly because of stiff competition from this era. There's some good costume design as well. The Marshmen I think look pretty decent as monsters. Obviously they look a bit like a rubber suit, but that's because they are a rubber suit, and that's what Doctor Who had the budget for. You've got to accept that, and overall I think it does a good job. So with all that stuff out the way, let's look at the script, and it's an interesting one because it had a very unique genesis. Some shows do have what is known as an open submission policy, where any old fucker can submit a script that might well be made into an episode. As a science fiction example, Star Trek The Next Generation had this policy throughout most of its run. Now, obviously most submissions will be from amateurs, which means said show's writing staff will need to make considerable changes to the scripts in order to make it actually filmable, because even the best amateurs won't be able to completely fit the parameters of budget and production, etc. and so forth. Now, Doctor Who has never really had this policy, and you won't find many examples of it throughout its run. Certainly not in New Who, anyways, this kind of thing isn't really practiced anymore. And even in the classic series it was rare. This story is one of the very few. If there are any others, none spring to mind off the top of my head. The credited writer of Full Circle was Andrew Smith, who had sent several scripts in before, and indeed after this one, and this was the only one ever picked up. Smith was, by the way, 17 years of age at this point, and I can't help seeing that as an enormous red flag. I think back to my own skills as a writer and how I understood stories 10 years ago when I was that age, and frankly I was a bloody idiot who didn't understand one of the basics of storytelling, and that's to be expected. With experience you learn and grow, and your horizons broaden, but it does mean that this is a story written by someone who hadn't quite had that experience yet. Now, I don't want to sound like this is going to be a big rant about how Smith is terrible, because that's not the case for two reasons. Firstly, because it's pretty obvious this was rewritten pretty substantially, either by Bidmead himself or by Smith under Bidmead's very heavy-handed guidance. And as I said, that can often be the case with submissions like this. Firstly, and most obviously, Smith would have not included all the E-Space stuff, but you can also look up Smith's original idea, and it's actually pretty different to what the story ended up with. Smith might have been the credited writer, but that's because Bidmead couldn't be credited because he was the script editor. It's probably not exactly the same thing, but it's a good example. David Whittaker gets the writing credit to the Ambassadors of Death, even though the final version bears little resemblance to his original ideas, because there are rules about crediting writers that have to be followed. Now, I'm not saying this was definitely the case that Bidmead wrote the whole thing, but he certainly had a very, very considerable influence in how it was put together at the least, and, well, a lot of his fingerprints are all over it, so I don't think this is completely unfounded. Secondly, the stuff that is clearly Smith's idea are actually some of the more interesting parts of the story. In fact, its flaws are almost certainly that of Bidmead, and not the 17-year-old who had a good idea. So no, I'm not going to blame anything on the fact they took an open submission from someone not old enough to drink or vote. Do I think it was a good idea? No, not really. The time Bidmead probably spent turning this into a workable script could probably have been better spent on him just writing his own story straight away, or perhaps commissioning an actual writer, and is indicative of the J&T approach of trying things they probably should not have done that would eventually lead to this decade becoming a bit of a mess overall, but I don't think this hurts this particular story. This leads me, I suppose, into talking about what I think does work about this story, and there's quite a few bits here. Firstly, I think the central idea is a very good one. Taking the generic monster story that was apparently Smith's original idea and turning it into something rather interesting and unique. Spoilers, I guess, although I never really say that. So, anyway, the idea that the Marshmen are really the same species as the Alzarians they're in conflict with is something you never see coming, especially with how at odds it is with the kind of thing that is usually done in Doctor Who. It's a completely typical spin on it's an interesting spin on the typical approach for the show, having the rampaging monsters with something more unique as the meat behind it. All it takes is comparing it to the last time the show did rampaging monsters before this, where the ridiculous-looking mandrills are actually made of drugs for some reason, and have their most famous publicity photo be giving the Doctor a hug. It's pretty much night and day, really. Here there's layers to the monster, which help ground it, give it a sense of depth, and add more to the storytelling. The Marshmen themselves are a play on a typical sci-fi idea, the monstrous, slimy creatures that rise out of the swamp. And I like that it's taken a simple, old-school idea and both playing it straight, the Part 1 cliffhanger is straight out of a B-movie in a good way, and doing more with it, exploring that the Marshmen clearly have a level of intelligence beyond what you'd initially expect, and they have some level of sapience means that they should be treated as such, thus leading to sympathy when the Marshchild isn't treated as such. They're monsters, but not villains in this. We see it as a situation of greys, and that's a good thing. It allows us to see past human and slimy monster and see both on their merits and otherwise, and all from the creatures from the Black Lagoon, not bad, I'd say. In more general stuff, the story is paced very well, admittedly quite a bit of that may well be Grimwade, but the way the script is structured helps as well. It wisely builds up its mysteries, adding more and more questions, and actually taking its time to answer any of them at all. Part 1, for instance, just gives us more and more information about new things, but not stopping to exposit about any of them, just letting us see, not be told, without it becoming overwhelming either. Admittedly, this falls apart later when everything gets exposited at us, either through the Doctor bickering with the Sidles, or when he has the young Alzarians to explain all the science stuff to, but early on it works. The structure also does well at keeping the story fresh and making sure things move well. It strikes a fine balance between keeping things deliberately vague for dramatic purposes, and not being annoying and not ever moving with its bloody plots. And it strikes that fine balance well. Another area it does well is how it portrays the society of the Alzarians. Essentially, it's a good look at how a society that depends on a lie, and how toxic and ultimately futile that society can be. We see the complicity of the society in covering it up, but its leaders have, without fail, up until the events of the story, decided to continue maintaining it, perhaps to maintain their own order because they cannot see the population accepting the truth. The audience is in its own way allowed to decide. Whatever the reason, it's led to stagnation and ultimately suffering for the people, as it's what's keeping them here. This works very well in a few ways. Firstly, in that it leads to some of the episode's best twists. They hit the right balance between being neither being so blatantly obvious that it might as well be written on all the characters' foreheads, nor coming out of the writer's arse, both approaches being commonly favoured by those who have written New Who. Instead, the reveal, for instance, that the Starliner is fine, it would take a bit of light repair work that would take less than an hour before it could take off, that's a great twist. There wasn't a hint of it beforehand, but in hindsight, especially as we learn about the lies of the Heart of the Decider's way of leading, it makes perfect sense. The fact that they also, again, the reason they can't leave is because they don't have a pilot, that's kind of the same kind of thing. It also adds into the idea about their society. Secondly, it is a good look at societal decay, intellectual bankruptcy, and corruption. It's more the complex stuff I think is more in Bidme's wheelhouse. Because, well, later in the 80s or throughout much of New Who, this would have been a straight-up message show about Western society, or more likely the Thatcher era if we're talking about the McCoy era, or something like that. The link would have been completely undeniable, and it would have become kind of hitting you on the head as a result, which is never a good thing in my view. Here, though, it's more subtle. It's not saying anything about specific society, just societies in general, and it allows the audience to make their own links to the real world as they need to. And it's about the pitfalls of human nature and human decision-making and stuff like that. So yeah, I like its stuff. It's a solid central idea that adds another unique twist to what could have become a pedestrian idea. Finally, there's what I actually think is the best part of the story, which is a few scenes at its very start. Part 1 picks up where Meglos left off, with a message from Gallifrey recalling the Doctor and Romana. The implication is pretty obvious, and indeed Romana spells it out. They want her back. This is great stuff, because it does a lot of what I said earlier on. It introduces continuity and consequences, and highlighting character growth and change. Romana did only come along for the key to time, but she's changed since then. Well, obviously she's regenerated, that's not what I mean. I mean her character evolved. She went up from an up-her-own-arse elitist academic to someone who relishes what travel with the Doctor does for her, giving her experiences she couldn't have dreamed of. It has changed her, and is seen as a fantastic way of showing that in very simple terms. Equally great is how the Doctor reacts. He doesn't want to see her go any more than she wants to go, but there's a weary acceptance in his remarks.
You can't fight Time Lords, Romana.
You did. Once.
And lost.
This is a great moment. For those in the know, it harks back to the War Games as a reminder of why the Doctor is acting like this. He doesn't want to see Romana end up like Jamie and Zoe. And for those not in the know, it's a quick bit they'll get the meaning of. Just from what the Doctor says. The Doctor knows it's not a winnable fight, and it's clearly a horrifying prospect to him, but there's nothing he can do. It's one of the few times we see the Fourth Doctor defeated like this. Baker and Ward excel in the scene. Clearly this was filmed at a time when they could bear to be in the same room as each other, which obviously wasn't a given at this point. And it's not a long or massively overbearing scene. It's not even 2 minutes before K9, the clumsy fucker, accidentally flies the TARDIS into the plot MacGuffin and starts up the actual story. It does not stay its welcome, but it's a great scene focusing on character, which is always something I think is a good idea. Which also leads me into when the story doesn't do so well, which is character in pretty much the entire rest of the story. It's fair to say this wasn't a particularly great strength for Mr. Bidmead. Plot, sciencey stuff, he could do that pretty well, but character not especially. Now, to be fair, I don't personally know how much was actually him and how much of the actual writing Smith did, but this brings me back to the original point. I don't expect a 17-year-old to have much insight on how to write effective characters, so this should have been something the script editor was tidying up at the very least. So either he didn't, or he did and did it badly. So the point does stand that this neatly demonstrates how this is not a particular strength of his. We'll start with the Deciders, which is a great name for a group of people who decide things. Anyway, they're generic as hell. The main one who's dead before the end of part 1 is also old and knowing, and that's his entire character, while the other two main ones are dull as dirt and have no personality. I think one might have been a bit more in favour of ending their lying policy than the other, but I couldn't tell you which was which. They're just generic, corrupt leader types, and that's all. The new third one, Logan, played by George Baker, who, fun fact, dubbed over George Lazenby as James Bond for a significant portion of the Manchester Secret Service. Anyway, Logan is an interesting idea, because apparently he's a respected member of the community who gets made into a new decider when the original one gets killed because of Adric. Yes, Adric very much starts as he means to finish, but we'll get to that. Anyway, he also has a daughter who's part of the Young'un group, which means he's torn up about her, and this motivates his actions throughout the story because, well, torn between his loyalty to his people and to his duty and his loyalty to her. And that's the theory. The problem is we're more or less told that through exposition, and the actual portrayal is generic. Logan's motivations and loyalties seemingly change from scene to scene. You never get the sense from him, beyond dry exposition, that he is particularly torn. It doesn't feel like he ever has really had to choose between one or the other, or indeed reckon with the choices he faces. The idea, I think, is he is a good man, respected and motivated by what he feels right, but also by his own emotions, and thus he's the person to move things along from where they are, but that's all kind of just theory, idea. It's not really played out in practice in the story. It just fits the plot without having the actual character needing to play that role, and it doesn't help with the idea that after 40,000 generations, it's only now at this point they're choosing a respected figure in the community who'll do what's right and not someone who'll just stay along with the lie. This unfortunately lets down the thematic side, it just feels generic and boring, and the exposition replacing actual plot developments doesn't help. I should like their arguments with the Doctor a lot more than I should. Speaking of which, there's also an evil scientist character, because of course there is. Dexter, who wins the prize for Doctor Who character who most sounds like a city in Devon, is a generic immoral scientist whose "oh, I do terrible things for scientific advancement" spiel is so boringly flat and predictable you could probably guess most of his dialogue yourself if you cared to. It's very frustrating that the idea behind this plot, that following this poor Marsh child just captured and experimented on, showing that the Marshmen are far more intelligent than you'd think initially, and that society has been so corrupted by its lies it would do something like that, is extremely good, and putting the Doctor into it and his obvious moral outrage of such a thing is an even better idea. But it's not lived up to because the reasons behind the science are so flat and dull, and the motivation so laughably generic. The Doctor's outrage is therefore cheapened as a result because, well, we feel less of it than we should because of how little emotional investment has really been created as a result. The problem with the "I'm doing bad things for science" thing is that it's even ignoring that it's overdone in sci-fi, although it just leads to nothing in terms of that character or plot development. Okay, you're doing bad things to science. The question is then, why? For what end? What does that play into the motivations of the character or their allegiances? What does it say about the society? 9 times out of 10, I don't bother answering that question, and this isn't the one. It's disappointing when there's potential here, but I just fell back on an annoying and untired cliche. Anyway, what else is there? Oh yeah, this is of course the introductory story of everyone's favourite shithead, Adric. Now, the character himself is a discussion for another time, because frankly life's too short, but I think the problem with his character from the word go was the conception. There's a documentary on one of the DVDs from his time on the show, I forget which, and I'm not going through every documentary from Full Circle to Earthshock to find it, but one of the interviewees says everyone hates boy geniuses, and that's basically the crux of it. Adric was Wesley Crusher a decade or so earlier, and everyone hates them. Smug little know-it-alls who inevitably end up saving everyone else despite acting like morons the whole time. Well, that certainly sounds like Adric, doesn't it? Now, I'll say a few things. Despite the stories about Matthew Waterhouse being a little shit, I don't blame him for how the character turned out, not at all. I think it's clear he was just given bad and directionless instructions, and JNT in particular had no real conception for the character beyond the utter basics, a theme that would be repeated several times throughout the 80s. I'll also say at his moments, unlike say Clara, who just irritated me pretty much every time she appeared on screen, Adric's use of unlikability depended heavily on who was writing him and how. He's a much better character in Legopolis than he is in Fort to Doomsday, for instance. In this story, he's not great, but he could be worse. He's a bit of an idiot, he acts petulantly arrogant and superior at times, particularly with the people he particularly cares about, when he basically says to his brother and all his other friends, "I'm so much better than you" at the start. That really endears him. But there are signs there's a bit of depth to it. His conflicted loyalties between the Young'uns and the Doctor and Romana is actually done pretty well. He does seem to genuinely regret having to go against them and tries to do his best to help them when he can. It does show there's more to him than that. And he has his moments of usefulness as well. It's clearly early days. Waterhouse does not have a real grip on the character at this point, so there are awkward moments. I feel him sort of being entirely responsible for the death of the original Decider at the start was maybe not a great call, and he does sort of fade into the background at points. I suspect they didn't really know how to use him. Well, did they ever? But anyway, as for his gang of Alzarian young'uns, well, frankly, I barely care because none of them are the characters, and their rebellious youth antics don't have anything like that because like the depth that's needed to make it work. Again, there's potential lost here, because I think you could have made some interesting commentaries on the societal stuff. How youth react is an interesting way to explore a society, but it is just a plot device. Isn't everything, really? Finally, there's the two regulars. Oh, and K9, who gets his head knocked off about halfway through, because man, do they really hate K9 at this point in the show for some reason. Why don't you just leave K9 alone? K9's great. Anyway, the two regulars, apart from that opening scene, don't really feel there's much to commend. Romana, in particular, does not have a good time. Her characteristic wit and intelligence more or less deserts her as she ends up getting possessed for half the story. The cliffhanger for part 2 is an embarrassing moment for her and a bizarre one in general, where she goes, "It's only a spider," and an oddly uninquisitive and therefore out of character moment for her, until she gets attacked by said spider and possessed. Good job, Romana. So yeah, not brilliant, and again, she spends the second half of the story possessed, so there's not really much she can do there. As for the Doctor, well, it's not like there was much to explore that was new with the Fourth Doctor at this juncture. The scene at the start I spoke about was as much as there was going to happen there. He has his moments through this, his attempts to help the Marsh child and his utter outrage at the experimentation on it and its eventual death gives us an actually not often seen angle on the Fourth Doctor, how very pissed off he was that he can get, and how despite his often playful exterior there's a man with very deep moral compass beneath the surface. Stuff that's hardly new, this was the 7th season of it, but it's not always seen and it's done quite well here. Apart from that, though, sadly, it's much as wandering around and expositing and not much else. Again, I suppose wanting a unique angle when there wasn't really one to find at this point was probably not going to happen, but it does feel like it's just not quite there. There were a lot of gaps to be filled in the Doctor's arc here. And I suppose that's the story. It's fine. It's enjoyable enough, actually. I certainly would not recommend against sitting down and watching it. And it has its strong points. You won't be bored or annoyed. I think it's actually decent. It's good. But it's not more than that, and it probably could have been, which is a shame. I think it is a good show of Bidme's strengths and weaknesses. A fine plot with great ideas, and I think some of those bits he did a really good job in translating a lot of Smith's simpler ideas into something more unique and interesting, but he doesn't succeed with character, and also his dialogue isn't great, which I haven't mentioned yet, but he doesn't have a knack for writing dialogue that sounds so very unnatural. Not quite in the same league as Stephen Moffat, mind, but not that far off. I think Smith had some good ideas, but a lot of the story comes from a 17-year-old is painfully obvious because, well, someone that young thinks in terms of the big picture with their writing. Their ideas and how to put those together, rather than focusing on the important little things like, well, decent characters. And again, it was not the strength of Bidme's to fix it. I think he fixed the things he was good at and sort of left the rest. Maybe. I don't know, I wasn't there. As for the trilogy itself, well, I think my big problem is that there were at least 2 of the 3 stories could have easily been told in the normal universe, and this one is definitely one of them. There's nothing to place this in E-Space in any real way, and I think that's kind of a waste of potential, particularly when the idea is having continuity and consequences for things. Now, Christ knows how they have added stuff like that to this, which kind of brings it back to, I think it was a mistake to even have the script written by a 17-year-old in the slot where you're introducing a major story arc, but oh well. I'll say the trilogy as a whole is something I'll be getting into more as I discuss the other 2 stories. I'll probably do a big sum up once I get to the end of Warrior's Gate, so I won't talk too much of it now. But when I get to those stories is another thing entirely. I will, just maybe not that soon. So anyway, it brings us to the final score. I'd say it's 5 out of 10. It's average Classic Who. It's watchable, enjoyable, nobody will say they dislike it. Certainly has some pretty strong stuff in it, but ultimately it doesn't really get close to greatness. Just one too many generic characters and ideas that bring it down a bit for me. I like it, I don't love it, and I think for me that works as average Classic Who. So eventually we'll get to the other 2 stories of the trilogy, but maybe not soon, as there's a lot to look at. Dalek stories, lore stories, and maybe 1 or 2 new things. But next time it'll be Halloween, and the perfect time to look at an episode with a Halloween staple. Yes, ghosts! Ooh! Yeah, it's the Unquiet Dead next time.